Thanks a lot, Mr. Matt Sheehan, for taking this interview with us. Your recent article with Carnegie is very interesting, looking at Chinese regulatory trends on AI and the latest developments. So, on the topic of AI safety, you noted that there's been a shift in regulatory attitude, the government's attitude toward more concerns for AI safety. But are we seeing like Jeffrey Hinton, Yuval Harari kind of concerns in China as yet, or is this only just a start for the kind of what's popularly known in the West as doomerism kind of concerns?
Yeah, so over the past 2 years, I'd say we've seen a big shift in how parts of the Chinese technical community think about it. And we're starting to see hints of a shift or suggestions that there might be a shift within the bureaucratic regulatory community. I think of there being kind of we have three main communities here. You have kind of your technical community, especially your elite technical community. You have your policy advisors, policy influencers, who are often academics at universities, usually in Beijing. A lot of them are legal scholars. Some of them specialize in technology and innovation. And then you have maybe your elite decision makers within the CCP and within the Chinese government. And within these sort of three camps, I'd say by far the strongest and the clearest shift has been within the elite technical community in China. And that's where you do see concerns that are analogous to Jeffrey Hinton, Yoshua Bengio, some of the sort of elite scientists in the West. Many of them are the pioneers of deep learning, of sort of modern day machine learning and AI, who have come out really in the last couple of years, but some of them even earlier than that, as being especially concerned about catastrophic risk from AI. This is something that we've seen just little hints of in China prior to this. You'd had a handful of AI scientists that had spoken about these risks, had written some technical research, done some technical research on them. And in some policy context, we had sort of maybe very light or vague references to these concerns, in particular to loss of control, which is one of the terms that gets used around these issues. Loss of human control over AI, I should say. And then, say, in the post-ChatGPT world, we saw a significant shift on this in the West. That's around the time that Jeffrey Hinton and Yoshua Bengio, two of the pioneering AI scientists, really came out forcefully on issues of AI safety. And then over the last 18 months or so, we've seen those concerns surface within the same, sort of their peers within the Chinese community. So these are people like Andrew Yao, Yao Tijie, who's maybe the most respected computer scientist in China, the only Turing Award winner based in China. People who lead some of the key research labs like Shanghai AI Lab or Beijing Academy of AI. So people like Zhang Hongjiang, Zhang Yaqin, Zhou Bowen, people like that. And oftentimes we saw some of their first comments on these issues come in forms where they're engaging with the international scholars. So, for example, in June 2023, the Beijing Academy of AI had sort of a full-day forum on AI safety, where you had people like Andrew Yao directly engaging with people like Stuart Russell from Berkeley. We started in that fall to have these international dialogues on AI safety, gatherings of academic researchers in the West and in China, releasing these statements on catastrophic risk. But I'd say you really had this kind of building momentum within that elite technical community over the last 18 months. And then we've seen just these initially sort of, I'd say, somewhat weak hints that this is starting to make it into the CCP decision-making at elite levels. So when China released the Global AI Governance Initiative last October, it included a line about always ensuring human control over AI. And that's a sort of an AI safety coded language that had previously only appeared in sort of one document from some policy advisors to the Ministry of Science and Technology. And that's kind of plays into this larger theme that there are, from what we can tell from the outside at least, there appear to be pretty big differences in how different parts of the Chinese bureaucracy view this, where the Ministry of Science and Technology seems to be more vocal, more concerned about these risks, and other areas like the CAC have not been as concerned. But we had those initial hints last year, and then some building suggestions, some of it in state media, to the point where this summer in the decision document for the third plenum, we had a line in there about setting up oversight systems to ensure the safety of AI. It was 建立人工智能安全监管机制, something like that. And that was the sort of first and I'd say the clearest signal that the highest decision makers within the central government are at least aware of and are pushing for more attention to these concerns. There's lots of open questions about what does that mean? Does this mean they're going to pass a new regulation? Does it mean they're going to set up an AI safety institute? Are we even 100% sure that they're talking about the same type of safety as in the West? These are still somewhat open questions, but I'd say we're in a much different place than we were 18 months ago.
Yes. It's interesting in public discourse, the topic of AI safety or potential catastrophic um, risks posed by AI for the human race. In China, it's not so hot a topic as I would say in the West, especially in the US, because in the US, you see all of these debates, public debates between top scientists like Benjio, Hinton, and LeCun on the other side, and some of the entrepreneurs and AI scientists within top technology companies going on all the time. People are constantly reminded of this ongoing debate. But in China, it seems most of the attention are still on some of the star companies, whether they're chips or large language model developers or business application kind of companies, and more on the stock prices than some of the more fundamental debates. But as you mentioned, these scientists like Yao Qizhi or Zhang Hongjiang, Zhang Yaqin, they seem to have the ears of very senior party and government leadership. So these concerns, as reflected in the Chinese regulations and legislations, seem to be kind of a top-down kind of consciousness and effort. Would you say that that's what you found in your research?
Yeah, I think in the West, in the United States, there's a long history of talking about these concerns, even just in our sci-fi writing. It's kind of really baked into American futurism, American visions of dystopian technology futures, and that has a long sort of cultural history. It's very much part of our psyche. And then you also have a more recent history, a history of 10, 15 years, where these concerns have been, at least in part, the motivation for the founding of some of the leading AI companies. So the founders of OpenAI have, from the beginning, said that one of their motivations for founding the company and doing this is concerns about future AI risks and the desire to, we want to build it first so that we can make sure that it's built safely, that type of thing. I think there's a lot of questions over, is that a good strategy? Are they still concerned about that, et cetera? But it is built into sort of the founding mythology or the founding ethos of these companies. And I think it's in part also, it's a little bit cultural in the sense that, business has like cultural components to it. The US labs have the US labs, the US companies at the frontier of AI, and including places like DeepMind in the UK, they tend to have a long runway. They're given a long leash, a lot of room to develop without sort of the pressure to turn a profit in the near term. So, like Google could be working on autonomous vehicles for a decade before there was any pressure to commercialize. OpenAI for many years was not building really commercial products. They were building demonstrations of what you can do with AI, and the same thing with DeepMind. And in part, that sort of long runway has given them almost the space to explore these concerns and to explore the science and the technology towards building in that direction. Whereas Chinese companies, technology companies over the last decade have traditionally just not had that much breathing room. Maybe you can get funding, but there's pressure from investors quite early on to build a product, turn a profit, ideally list as early as possible and let the investors make their money back. And so, in a lot of ways, that'll shape your sort of field of vision or what you're thinking about and concerned about. I think that's played into some of this baseline difference in the levels of discourse around this. And as we've in the last couple of years transitioned to these higher, greater salience or higher profile concerns among China's high profile scientists, it's been interesting to watch, where do they make these statements and do they immediately resonate with the political leadership? I think lots of these people, those that you mentioned, they are some of the most respected scientists. They often lead research institutions. Some of them, although not all of them, serve on these sort of official advisory bodies like the Ministry of Science and Technology's next generation AI expert advisory bodies, stuff like that. But they're not hugely political creatures. It's almost like they have a lot of respect, and I think their voices are very much listened to, but they're not as, I'd say, deeply embedded in the S&T, science and technology bureaucracy and policy making as some other people. So watching these concerns migrate or not into the CCP has been kind of the big open question for the last year or not. Are we sure that these are being heard? If they are being heard, how are they being received? Because the scientists, both in China and the West, they have a tendency to have a very international outlook and one that's not as clouded by geopolitics. The many Western scientists, it seems completely obvious that you would be talking to your peers in China about these issues. They don't even see their identities as so sort of nationally driven. But once you port these concerns over to government, it's a much different story. The Chinese government sees this very much as a geopolitical issue. The U.S. government sees it very much as a geopolitical issue. And there's a question of essentially how far can this cooperation or coordination or dialogue on these issues go without treading into what the politicians would consider dangerous territory when it comes to competition.
Yes, these dialogues or collaboration between top scientists seems still to be going on. I was just reading a news story on Chinese news platforms earlier this month, beginning of September in Venice. Yao Qizhi and Zhang Yaqin and Zhang Hongjiang, they met again with Ben Gio and Stuart Russell and the like in another one of these scientists meetings. Ever since the London AI summit, it seems like Chinese scientists have been regularly going to these international conferences and meeting with the same group of peers. This seems to be the only one of the few very active venues of exchange between the larger AI community. And of course, we all know in terms of AI chips, in terms of developing large language models, China's still very much a follower, although making a lot of progress. Maybe in terms of business applications, it's more of a very active scene. But between the scientists, they have seem to have built a very strong bond. As you mentioned, these could soon begin to touch on some very, very sensitive geopolitical nerves back with the authorities. So where do you see this kind of scientific dialogue between top scientists going between China and the West, especially the US?
Yeah, I think I see these dialogues between scientists as a really key piece of the puzzle. This is not going to necessarily sort of translate into policy. It's not going to directly translate into the U.S. and China signing some type of a treaty in which they agree to, limit or constrain sort of AI development that might be dangerous. I don't see it as a line between sort of dialogue and then binding treaties. I think the much more realistic possibility is that the U.S. and China are going to be taking actions to push for safety, sort of domestically and of their own accord. Like if the United States is taking sort of actions to ensure AI safety, it's going to need to do it domestically and for its own reasons. China is going to need to do it domestically and for its own reasons. If we're relying on the two countries essentially trusting each other, that's just not a very stable, reliable foundation at this point in time. They just don't trust each other fundamentally. But we could be in a situation where, and they begin taking domestic actions, we can essentially have safety in parallel. The US is taking steps, China is taking steps. All along the way, we're having conversations about, what are the steps we're taking? What are we finding to be effective? Maybe limited technical exchanges about how we are approaching these issues. And we're taking the steps in parallel. The fact that we know the other person is taking the steps gives us some greater confidence. It makes us feel like we're not totally alone in this. We're not going to totally be sort of, left in the dust if we take some action. And we build up some sort of confidence over time where we might eventually get to a point where we have similar sort of safety ecosystems in both countries, and that makes a high level agreement possible. But I think the direction of travel is going to be much more this sort of domestic, bottom up, in parallel, as opposed to we sign an agreement and then we both push it onto our two ecosystems.
Right. So, do you see any repeat or further iterations of the London, the Bletchley AI Summit? Or do you think going forward this will still be more like the top scientists, peers who are very friendly and familiar with each other, kind of getting into regular, more academic gatherings to exchange ideas and practices?
I think it's going to be both, and it's going to be a lot of stuff sort of in between there. So the summits, we know there's going to be another summit in Paris in February. These summits have kind of evolved over time. We had Bletchley in the UK, we had Seoul in Korea, now we have Paris. I think they evolved from the initial one in Bletchley in the UK was very safety focused. It was the AI Safety Summit. Since then, they've kind of transitioned it towards a more broader AI summit across many issues. I don't necessarily think that's a good idea. I think they might be kind of losing their focus a little bit, but they still serve as an important venue for conversation. Some of it symbolic, some of it practical. That'll keep happening at a sort of a global international level. We'll keep having these scientific dialogues. We'll also probably keep having other forms of what are usually called track two dialogues, where track one is the government to government, track two is policy advisors in both communities talking to each other, or scientists in both communities talking to each other, which then sort of informs the government dialogue, but doesn't necessarily lead to any sort of binding agreement. So I think we're going to have these international summits. We're going to have track two dialogues. We'll probably continue to have the US-China government-to-government dialogue, and we'll sort of slowly be pushing in this direction. I think one analogy that can be helpful here, it's not perfect, but is the way that the US and China eventually found common ground on global warming, which eventually led to the Paris Summit. You had, years, really like decades, in which the US and China were far apart on issues of climate change. The US said, China needs to reduce its emissions. China said, we're a developing country, it's your fault. And this seemed like a very intractable problem for a long time. But over time, throughout the 2000s, you had the scientific communities in the two countries slowly coming to a consensus that this is a real concern. Whether we like it or not, whether we want to cooperate or not, this is a real concern. Even after they do that, you still have geopolitical issues. That I think it was the Copenhagen Summit in 2009. The US and China, basically a shouting match, and there's no international agreement. But over the course of the Obama administration, we had these bilateral meetings between Obama and Xi, in which they agreed on a set of bilateral steps that didn't take the form of a binding international treaty, but we both made commitments. What are we going to do individually? But we made those commitments sort of at the same time. We didn't make the same commitments. We didn't take the same actions, but we did things in parallel, and we talked to each other as we were doing it. And over the course of 2014, 2015, I think you had 2 rounds of these bilateral announcements that essentially set the stage for an eventual, I was about to call it the Paris Summit, the Paris Accord in 2015, 16. I think that model might be one that plays out here in AI as well. You first need to have the scientific communities in both countries tell their leadership this is a real issue. They often do that by talking to each other. After that, you're still going to have a lot of political tension, but as each country believes it's an issue they need to take action on, they take action for their own reasons, we move towards some level of bilateral, essentially doing these things in parallel. Then we move to some level of coordination, and maybe eventually we move to a sort of an internationally binding treaty on this. Even then, it's a very delicate process. The U.S. obviously pulled out of the Paris Accord under Trump. But I think that model of building from scientific consensus to domestic action to coordinated action to maybe a treaty is one that we could learn from here.
Right. In terms of domestic public and political support for this kind of collaboration and dialogue, do you see the U.S., whoever comes to the White House next year, do you see risk factors that could see domestic support drop off, or do you think that, well, either party could still treat this as a, one of a few areas they can still talk to China on?
Yeah, it's a very yeah, it's a very contentious issue in the U.S. and it's to a well, in many ways, sort of China policy is largely bipartisan in the U.S. in that both Democrats and Republicans take a very hard line on China across a bunch of issues. While that sort of broader China policy is bipartisan, I think on AI there is something of a divide between the parties. There's a divide in terms of how do they just think about AI development and AI safety in the first place, and then whether or not this is something that we should talk to China about. So on, whether or not what do the two parties think of AI safety? Generally, the Biden administration, and to a certain extent, the Democratic Party more widely, but especially the Biden administration, I think take this issue pretty seriously. They, through the executive order, through the establishment of an AI Safety Institute, and work with the UK on this, they've demonstrated that they do believe that this is a serious problem and one that the US is going to take domestic sort of unilateral action on, and that it's going to look to work with allies and even in limited capacity, talk to China about. The Republican Party is, I'd say their views on AI safety, AI risk are not totally set in stone, but at least there are certain currents, certain sort of influential advisors to the Republican Party that are sort of explicitly against the idea of AI safety. They think that actually what we need to do is accelerate AI development, faster than ever, both for the purposes of, beating China, but also for the purposes of, sort of domestic vitality for what AI can do for us. I think this is represented by some of the more Silicon Valley, some of the venture capitalists in Silicon Valley who have come out in favor of Trump, and that I think hold a lot of influence in the Republican Party. So there's that sort of domestic attitude towards AI development and AI safety in the first place, and then there's the question of whether or not we should talk to China about this. And I think I personally think there's a very compelling case for why, even if you are fiercely competing against China across every dimension, even if you are doing everything in your power to win the race and to stay ahead of China or to undercut Chinese AI capabilities, even in that scenario, even if you accept all that, there's still a good reason to talk to China about AI safety. No matter what the U.S. does, there's a very good chance that China is going to be closely following the U.S. when it comes to AI development. And if China is closely following the U.S., then you're both going to need to be implementing safety measures. It's not enough just to quote unquote win. Both countries need to be developing it safely. I feel very strongly about that argument, but it doesn't have universal acceptance within the U.S. I think there's a strong narrative that emerged over the course of the Obama administration and say the second half of the Obama administration and the Trump administration and Biden, that the narrative is that China uses dialogue and conversation as a way to essentially get the U.S. to not take action. That it will constantly, it'll offer a dialogue, but then as soon as the U.S. does anything it doesn't like, it'll take that dialogue away as a punishment until the U.S. sort of makes concessions. And this, there are reasons for this narrative. I think it has occurred that way in many areas. But I do think on AI and AI safety issues, there's definitely room for dialogue and there's a real sort of urgent need for it. So it partly depends on essentially how strongly the each party coalesces around that original narrative or the narrative that this is a very serious issue and one that we need to talk to China about regardless. I can't predict perfectly, but my guess would be that the Trump administration is a future Trump administration would be not very open to focusing on this issue and not open to speaking about it with China. And the future Harris administration would be focused on this issue and would be more open to speaking about it with China. But it's going to be a really difficult problem either way. And it's not just up to the U.S. In the Biden administration, there was the agreement between Biden and Xi to hold this first dialogue on AI. And I think many in the U.S. government went into that thinking, this is going to be a good chance to have these conversations with China about AI safety specifically. And the feeling was that while America sort of sent its AI people, China sort of sent its foreign policy people or U.S. policy people. The Chinese delegation was led or co-led by someone at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who's responsible for North America, whereas one of the leads on the U.S. side was the State Department official who's responsible for AI and emerging technology. And so the U.S. kind of needs a counterpart on this. They can't feel like we're coming to this to talk earnestly about AI, and China is treating this as like a U.S.-China foreign policy issue. We need to just manage we need to manage Sino-U.S. relations. So it's obviously not entirely up to the U.S. It's at least 50% up to China. But I do think there is a divergence between the parties.
Right, thanks. Zoom is reminding me we have 10 more minutes, so I think I'll just pop my last question. What about the prospect of AI regulation and policy making in terms of AI safety becoming yet another area of competition for global prestige or global status? Because the two countries, well, mostly are far ahead of other countries in terms of AI technology and business related AI. Um, and now they're so deep in dialogues. Of course, there are scientists from other countries as well, but it's still on the question of AI safety. They are the two leading voices. What if either side or both sides at some point realizing, well, instead of talking to each other and trying to come up with some kind of agreement, we could both go off in our own ways. Like in many other areas, we both propose to the world, to the rest of the world, a frame of AI safety ideas and policy recommendations and try to, bring the world, whatever part of the world, to our standard. Well, this could be another area of competition to show who's on top. What do you see the possibility of that happening?
Yeah, there's this kind of dueling narratives of race to the bottom in AI safety or race to the top, and the normal default is race to the bottom. Is the idea that both countries are going to be so afraid of falling behind one another that they are going to ignore safety to race ahead. I think that's that's a very real possibility that it goes that way. There's this aspirational idea that maybe the most prestigious or the most valuable, even just in an economic sense, thing will be to ensure the safety of your AI systems so that you can deploy them wider and in more interesting contexts. And the safety is what will sort of allow you to do that. So it becomes a race to the top. I think a lot of this, it depends on a few things, but one factor is basically what do other countries think or care about. And I think at this point in time, there are not that many other countries in the world that are thinking of AI safety as a very high priority at this point in time. Mostly because they are not facing these issues themselves. They are not developing, they're not at the frontier of AI. So they don't see themselves as like participating in that as needing to change their behavior on this. So usually, at least in terms of countries in the global south, developing countries, the emphasis is more on, who's going to help us deploy AI for our economic development needs, who's going to help us, who's going to do technology transfer and help us, use AI for all the very pressing needs that we do have. And this is something where both China and the US have tried to sort of say that they will play that role. I think China has been more vocal and stronger on this. They, in stuff like the Global AI Governance Initiative, they'll consistently say, a top priority should be addressing global inequalities in AI, and we should seek to diffuse this technology as widely as possible. I think there's part of that is an honest or an earnest, desire. They do see economic development as like the core project of nations, and they think that should be supported. It's also, there's a geopolitical angle there in that they, like in these statements, like the Global AI Governance Initiative, they talk about how some countries are using their position in AI to deny technology to some other countries. This is, of course, them referring to the US denying technology to China, but they're trying to make this a more kind of international issue, an issue of global equity and access, as opposed to a US-China issue. So I think that's currently sort of one play that's being made in this area, is for China to say, we're the country that's going to help you out, help you build your ecosystem and help you use AI for development. The US makes something of a similar case, but they don't really emphasize it to the same degree. Could they turn this around and turn it into a kind of, race to the top in safety? I think it's possible, but you'd need that demand from the other countries. You need other countries saying, hey, we prioritize this. We demand that you develop these systems safely. We're not going to buy your unsafe systems, or we are going to an international forums. We're going to block your proposals, or we're going to demand change on this. Even in that situation, the question of how much leverage these countries really have, I think is an open question. I think there's a good chance that the US and China just do what they want to do for their own reasons because they're superpowers, and that's generally what superpowers do. But you could see other countries trying to use this leverage and make these demands. I think a lot of it depends on how large is the gap between issues of AI safety in terms of catastrophic risk, loss of control, these sort of big picture concerns. How far are those from everyday issues of AI deployment, sort of safe deployment of AI in context? Some people think of these as going to be very separate issues. Frontier AI development, frontier AI safety is going to be way off over there. And it's going to be very, very different from the issue of, how reliable are autonomous vehicles, or how reliable is AI in power grids. And if that gap remains very wide, then it might be hard to sort of tie these two things together. But if we find that gap narrowing, if issues of maintaining control over AI systems end up being much more everyday problems of how do we ensure that we can embed these into our electrical grid safely, then that becomes it's an AI safety issue, and it's a very practical issue for countries. And I think if we end up in that world, then you might see countries putting more pressure on this on US and China, because it's an issue of economic development, it's a practical issue, and it's an issue of what are they going to buy. What are you going to buy has a big influence on what gets made.
Right. Yeah. Let's see what happens in due time. So that's it. Thank you so much for taking the time. I think it's rare to see somebody look so deep into Chinese AI policy making when a lot of exciting things are happening on the research and the business side of things. So really, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the
Thanks very
article.
much for having me.